G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day and so far a brilliant weekend as well. You're taking some time for you and your family. It's very, very important to do this. Now legends, of course, as always, we have a lot to go over, and looking at how much we've got, maybe we will break the 1 hour mark in what has become a solo man podcast at this point in time. But legends, look, what we're going to go over is, of course, we will look at the maps. We'll look at some geolocations of where things are moving. Sadly, Deep State Map has not updated, but we have other sources. I actually feel really bad for what has occurred to Deep State, as even if they continue from here, there will be questions around the legitimacy of that map. We need to talk about Kursk and North Korean soldiers, and we need to talk at length about the narrative there. Who has the incentive for this? What is actually happening? Are there thousands killed? What actual evidence? And we need to clear up maybe some misinformation around this as well. We need to talk about a shortage of men and the promised wonder weapon game changers, and people saying it was never promised is bullshit, of ATACMS and storm shadows and long-range strikes into Russia, and how many were put on hold for Ukraine to use, how many Ukraine's used, and how many are left. Very, very few numbers. We'll talk about that. And we need to look at the manpower shortage and how many men are actually in these battalions at a battalion minus. It's not a full unit. We'll look at what the men at the front line are actually saying, not propagandists on YouTube, TikTok, and Twitter, what actual guys at the front line are saying. And in my honest opinion, some of these hand-clapping, Kool-Aid drinking YouTubers, TikTokers, Twitter pages, especially the anonymous ones, because they're doing it facelessly, they don't have to own up to anything they've said. I think a lot of these people have absolutely blood on their hands for sharing narratives of which they know is incorrect, but pushing it because it suits what makes them emotionally happy. Jeffrey Sachs said in Tucker Carlson's interview recently that he knows journalists who behind closed doors say the exact opposite of what they report online or for the papers. And I can tell you from people I know and people I've worked with and whatever before, that is absolutely true. There's many people believe the opposite to what they actually put out. Blood on your hands. And we'll talk about the end to the war and what soldiers are foreseeing for this. So look, let's start with the North Koreans. And as people said, and I can't take props for this, but the ghost of Pyongyang. And what we have been speaking about is there's huge incentive for the narrative of North Koreans fighting. It has opened up then the use of long-range weapon systems. It has potentially, in the future, maybe open up South Korean systems, more strikes, maybe looser rules on some of those systems as well. But what it has also done is if Ukraine start losing ground in Sumy, then it can be sold as, well, there's 60,000 Russians, 12,000 North Koreans. Of course, we had to lose some of that ground in Kursk back into Sumy. And what you need to ask yourself in this is, where is the incentive for North Koreans? Is it in Russia's favour or Ukraine's favour? And in my opinion, as soon as Ukraine get a North Korean prisoner of war, he will be used very publicly for propaganda. We're being told thousands are being killed and wounded and thrown into war. Why have we not seen this, and why do we not have complete concrete evidence of this yet? I'm yet to see anything that I consider beyond reasonable doubt of North Koreans fighting, especially in the numbers that are claimed. And the numbers that are claimed, you would see a hell of a lot. Everything in this war is filmed, and it is in 1,000,000% Ukraine's interest to share this. Again, like we've been saying, as we get near to the end of the war, propaganda will increase massively, so will the brutality of the war and ferocity as well. And remember that both sides, they believe that only the other side has propaganda. They don't see their own, and the machines, both sides are running in overtime. But let's look at what could have been some misinformation, but I can't find the reverse image search because it's been reposted so many times. There's like tens of thousands of these to go through, but I've been sent this by many different people and even different screenshots, that this image that was shared of the claimed North Korean yesterday dates back into 2022. Now, I can't confirm that, so take that with a grain of salt, but I wouldn't be surprised around if this is doctored. So let's look at the North Korean note that people are releasing today and what Zelensky has said about this, as well as that situation in Kursk. So let's look at the Kursk situation. This is from Bloomberg, but the screenshot I've got here is from the Kyiv Independent. US officials told Bloomberg they believe Ukraine may only have a few months left in the incursion into Kursk Oblast until Ukraine's military is forced to retreat from the region or risk being encircled by the Russian forces. Speaking on the condition of anonymity to US officials told Bloomberg it was their hope that President Volodymyr Zelensky will retreat from Kursk Oblast in order to avoid suffering high casualties amid an ongoing Russian offensive to retake the territory. And about 50% has been lost here. Ukraine's general staff from Reuters, they say 40%, but it's somewhere in, I think I have it here, 482 kilometre squares is what is remaining there. We believe it was about 1,000 at one point. So I still think in this though, but you retreat out of here, what is then stopping then the Russian forces just crossing into Sumy if there's a redeployment here? Despite territorial losses, one US official told Bloomberg that Ukraine has managed to hold on to the territory longer than expected amid President Joe Biden's approval for Kyiv to use long-range missiles into Russia. Another official told Bloomberg they believe the intention was never to hold on to Kursk for the long term, but to provide shock at Ukraine's ability to conduct the incursion. In my opinion, Kursk is strategically the best thing that has happened for the Russians. It has tied up a lot of Ukrainian resources, and not only resources, but the best resources, the Abrams, the Challengers, the Leopards, the artillery, even a Patriot system up in that area, way away from where Russia have their priority number one and number two around that Pokrovsk Kurakhove front. I believe it's strategically the best thing there in the military aspect, but for Russia's informational warfare, it has been a massive hit, and for Ukraine's informational warfare, it has been a massive bonus. Of course, they have then had the long-range strikes and the potential for North Koreans and other movements from Kursk. But long-term, I think time will tell us that this was, in my opinion, a huge mistake. Zelensky said in September Ukraine is planning to hold this indefinitely. In addition, claimed 60,000 army personnel, Russians stationed in Kursk, and 12,000 North Korean soldiers have been fighting. In my opinion, from what we have seen, the numbers are nowhere near this. I believe that these are part of the propaganda here to soften the blow when Ukraine decide that they need to withdraw from the area or get pushed back. They go, look, we had 5,000 guys in there and we're up against 72,000 men. I've seen no evidence that the numbers are anywhere near that large in there, but I believe it's a part of the informational campaign here, and I'm going to show you why I believe so much is part of the informational campaign here. But the worst case is this is actually true, and if that is true, Sumy is in real trouble. If you could potentially have 70,000 guys then crossing into Sumy after Kursk, why would they stop there? That's a real problem, especially when we go into negotiations. As Ukrainian officials have previously said, they intend to use Ukraine's incursion into Kursk as leverage for possible peace negotiations following the inauguration of President-elect Donald Trump. Again, this is 482 square kilometres. It's irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. Trump has pledged the US to get out of Russia's war to negotiate a quick peace deal, with Ukrainian officials urging the incoming president to take peace through strength approach in negotiations. Kursk, 480 squares, even if it was 2,000 squares, will be a part of negotiations, but it's still going to be somewhat irrelevant. Now, we need to look at more of the evidence around North Koreans here and why I believe that this is part of a propaganda informational campaign. So let's have a look at this. This is from President Zelensky in Ukraine, of course. Donetsk directions are the toughest sap, Kherson, Kharkiv and region. Details about Kursk, battles and the participation of North Korean soldiers, saying they have a lot of losses, very much. And we see the Russian military and North Korean supervisors are not at all interested in the survival of these Koreans. Everything is done in such a way that it is impossible for us to capture the Koreans. That's convenient. I'm telling you right now, if you have killed 1,000 and wounded another 2,000 in that 3,000 makeup, something like this, there will be some that are alive and able to be taken POW, or they will defect or missing in action just statistically, even if it is 0.5%. You've got 10 guys. Anyway, done impossible for us to capture them. Their own people finish them off. There are such facts. Again, everything is videoed in this. We have seen cases of this previously, but not here yet, at least to what I've seen. And the Russians send them into assaults so they have a minimum of protection. Today, there are reports of several soldiers from North Korea. Our soldiers managed to take them prisoner, but they were seriously wounded and they could not be resuscitated. Again, this is convenient. Where is the evidence of this? Everyone has a GoPro. There's drones everywhere. Again, it is in Ukraine's interest to show this, to prove there are North Koreans here. We need more. I am of the opinion, I believe there are North Koreans here. In this many numbers, no. And sent in just meat waves, also no. Yes, moving across open fields in attritional protracted war, you're going to have massive losses and it can look like that. But as far as just to blow the whistle over the top boys fucking that direction, I just don't see that it doesn't make sense in any way. This is one of the manifestations of the madness of dictatorships are capable of. The Korean people should not lose their people in battles in Europe, and this can be influenced in particular by Korea's neighbours, including China. China is sincere about its statements that the war should not expand. It needs to exert appropriate influence on Pyongyang. Again, what I say is anyone has anything to benefit from this war, it's absolutely China. Russia's using a lot of their weapons. America's using a shitload of weapons. We see that they're basically out of ATACMS. There's a hell of a lot of shells being used too, way into reserves as well. China and its two main competitors of Russia and America, China has used nothing. It hasn't had economic effect like that. It's had nothing. It's been very minimal. I don't see it in China's interest to stop this war other than what they say politically. But then we hear things like this. North Korean divisions, which a North Korean division is around 10 to 12,000 soldiers, from at least my knowledge and research, continue to make absolute beating in Kursk region's frontline. Today, many were captured. And I agree with Mr. IL Libanese. He's saying, share one video of those captured and I'll start following you. And it is in Ukraine's interest to show this. If there's divisions, so multiple tens of thousands, okay, today many were captured, well, it's convenient then. Zelensky's saying, well, they could not be resuscitated, therefore we have nothing to show of this. And people are going, well, what about that note? I can hear people saying it right now. And this is where I still believe a lot of this is feeding into propaganda. So let's look at this and then we'll go over that note. And this is Goebbels, of course, infamous for being Hitler's propagandist. Evil, evil prick. But incredibly successful when you look at the spread and the success of that propaganda and influence. But good propaganda need not to lie. In fact, it must not lie. Propaganda makes use of the lie, cannot have success in the long run. The right idea must be set forth in the appropriate way. In other words, secret propaganda is to tell the truth in the appropriate form. So the way I'm reading into this is, and I've spoken about this and I've shared this a million times, is it's the truth, but in the appropriate form that fits you. I believe there are North Koreans operating, probably soldiers in the front line in Kursk as well. Almost definitely on artillery lines of North Korean caliber SPGs, self-propelled guns. Is it, though, these meat waves of divisions of 10,000 guys getting mowed down and whatever? No, but it is you hear and you pick at that thread and it comes out. What you need to ask yourself if you're doubting me, who stands to benefit the most from this? Russia, with guys with no combat experience, don't speak the language, filled with just propaganda in their head, but not your propaganda, running into this, or Ukraine, who could get South Korean weapons, it would be a massive hit, and of course, then the open up of long-range strategic strikes. So again, I believe there's some truth in this, but I believe it's being pushed out massively. And this goes into what I've been sharing a long time about if you see a sudden increase in propaganda in a protracted attritional war, this is what it can reveal here, is you are managing your morale, both internal of your population and, of course, your military perception of weakness. A focus on propaganda could be that this side is experiencing setbacks or vulnerability, and it could be a compensation to mask losses, challenges, or declining capacity. And what you're going to see with the limited amount of ATACMS, limited amount of storm shows, limited amount of men, what the guys at the front line are actually saying, this you can see, shaping international opinion. Of course, Ukraine can only continue this war as long as the international community is supporting Ukraine, their economy, their military, everything. And it could be to try and counteract narratives from the opponents to secure more international support. So your focus shifts onto this. If you were to Google Ukraine today, everything will be about North Koreans, not about just the front lines collapsing in the south and the east over many, many months. Preemptive justification propaganda might indicate preparation for a significant action, either escalation, retreat, or a controversial tactic. So take that as you will. Everything from having to withdraw in this retreat out of Kursk. I think there's pieces getting put into play for that. Targeting opponent's morale to exploit weaknesses, a shift in strategy where psychological operation is becoming a more central aspect of the war effort. This might happen if direct military victories are proving elusive. Military victories for Ukraine are absolutely elusive for the past 18 months. So you shift onto the psychological operations, escalation or desperation. Resource allocation indicators of resources funneled into informational warfare, either confidence or effectiveness, lack of capacity through other military means. So as you have a lack of capacity of missiles or this or that, like we said, you focus then on the psychological aspect. And then we go on to this about what if that propaganda is then not supporting military actions, it's more of a shift to other topics out of directly the front line. And we have gone through this the other day, but signs of internal weakness, shift in public attention, deprioritization of military goals and a loss of strategic focus. So if people are focusing on these meat waves, divisions getting mowed down of North Koreans, then it may shift people looking away from what is happening with the manpower, what is happening with the long-range strikes, what is happening with command and corruption and democracy, and what is happening in the south and the east. So you can see in this shifting narrative from survival, that is one of the main ones we have seen. And of course, that deflecting blame, we will see more and more and more. That's why I believe there are North Koreans probably participating in here, but that is a thread that's picked at and it's become a whole other thing. Because of the informational propaganda warfare, there's been an increase in Ukrainian propaganda due to the military losses in other areas to shift that and increase that coming into areas where we may see withdrawals or negotiations or whatever else to soften that blow. So let's look over this note that I know people will be talking about. So this is the note we have seen. Now, I've blurred this, but there is a man of Asian appearance then dead in the background. And this note says, death is not the end, but a beginning of eternal glory. Remember, warrior, remember your true fear is not death, but shame before your country be captured means to betray your comrades, your family, and your people. So this is being shared by all the pages saying they're giving these notes to North Koreans to then end their own lives instead of being captured. So therefore, we never see anyone captured. What goes into what Zelensky has said? Okay, then. Only those who prefer honour to weakness will become an example for the next generation. Your death on the battlefield will become a symbol of courage and resilience. Shame lasts longer than life, but glory to heroes is eternal. Holding a grenade firmly in your hand, boldly remove the safety catch and place the grenade under your chin or under your body armour. At the end of the day, these are still humans. So don't celebrate this, but also that there would just be, even if there's 1%, don't follow this order. Why are we not then seeing this? And many people, and this is what I hear, saying, well, how this is written is questionable. The first thing I noticed was the typography. The text is written in Mulgun Gothic, which is a default typeface for South Korea, beginning with Windows Vista. Gothic typefaces in general isn't used in North Korea. Again, not beyond reasonable doubt, but still questionable. North Korean predominantly uses serif fonts in official documents or propaganda material, closely aligned with the traditional calligraphic writing called this, the Pyongyang type here. The text uses not a single word or particle form which would be recognisably exclusive to North Korean vocabulary, where there should be so many, especially in military jargon or just text, not even a single comrade. Really bringing the question of how it is written. The spacing is also distinctly South Korean. In North Korean orthography, dependent nouns do not use spaces, and saying that where these pieces should have been written differently from what we are seeing. There are more smaller telltale signs like the colon here, warrior, remember. It is small, but it is there. North Korean texts do not commonly use colons. They are a much more westernized addition to Korean punctuation, used basically only in the South. Conclusion, whoever wrote the text is not at all familiar with the North Korean language, a variety of writing conventions. Much more likely is an online translation from another language, possibly Russian. So they're saying it could be Russian that they have translated online and given to these guys. So not saying it is a complete fake, but it could be, or printed on a Windows machine, or in short, it is fake. So again, we will see, but I think this is a lot of a small truth that is becoming something way bigger to support interests. And like I've said, in whose interest is it more so to have these Russians with guys who have no experience, filled with propaganda, don't speak the language, or Ukraine who then get attackers, storm shadows, potential South Korean arms, and a whole bunch of other support from around the world because a third country has entered the war. Again, that is my take on Kursk. Now we're going to look at the maps before we then step into the acute shortages of men, morale, and long-range strikes too. And that morale, that is a very important aspect. But with no changes on Kursk, sadly, the deep state map has not updated for us today. But to get an idea, here is Ukraine, the centre, the capital of Kyiv. Red areas occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. I'll be showing you some areas on this map just to line up for Syriac. But German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has said this in an interview. The Russian army, this is the question, is making more territorial gains in eastern Ukraine than it has in 2 years, and Putin will take advantage of this in possible negotiations. How can Ukraine's negotiating position be strengthened? Scholz answers, let us not forget, Putin has failed on all fronts in Ukraine. Well, we don't know that until the fat lady sings. And in this war, I say nothing is over until we see Zelensky put on an appropriate outfit for speaking in the US Congress, or to the most powerful areas in the world. Anyway, he wanted to subjugate the entire of Ukraine and establish a puppet regime. Again, we don't know yet the failure here. The success, if Ukraine steps away from this war without joining NATO, if we look at the goal of the war and what was the same goal throughout, it was that it can be sold as a success. Yes, there's probably 100, 200,000 guys dead in the dirt and another 500,000 or more who are wounded, but the goal of that has been the same throughout of not joining NATO, that still maintains. And we see Mark Rutte, NATO Secretary, saying that Russia is going to be more powerful in a few years and has moved its economic reliance away from Europe then to other markets. This has been good for Europe as well, because it has meant Europe has to move its reliance on Russia away to other markets too. But of course, there is short-term problems for both Russia and Europe in this, and we see the effect on the euro and the ruble due to this. He wants to prevent further rapprochement from the EU and weaken NATO as a whole. And today, NATO has 2 new members, Sweden and Finland. That said, I think, although you've got 2 new members, I think the divisions in NATO and the EU are higher than ever and being tested more and will be really, really tested whenever a negotiation process has to take place with those from like Slovakia, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and France and Germany, X, Y, and Z, especially with Trump coming in. We're all investing heavily in defence capabilities, and almost all NATO states are achieving 2% target. Ukraine is a stable nation. Okay, it's a default economy, and even before that had a coup. So yeah, okay, it's on its way to joining the EU. It has a strong army equipped by us, which is defending itself heroically against Putin's troops. It's now a matter of laying the foundation for fair and lasting peace. So this peace through strength argument. But here again, how can Ukraine's position be strengthened? Nothing in this says that. You've said how NATO can be strengthened. Yes, I agree, maybe somewhat. You've added some countries, people have increased spending, but I think the division is there. You've said that Putin and Russia is weakened and has failed here, but it was filibustering around the question of, but how is Ukraine going to be in the strongest possible position? So let's look at a few areas. Firstly, we'll come down into Toretsk. Now, I can't show any of the footage in this because it is brutal drone dropping footage, but this footage of Ukrainian drones striking Russian troops is 350 meters away from this blue roof we see right in here. So just out about in here. So we know that grey zone or red zone has definitely increased around Toretsk. And then we will push further down into Pokrovsk, then we'll go into the northeast. So, of course, this red check on this map, let me turn this off because this is not today. Today is the 28th. We have the Pokrovsk front and Russia continuing to push on many different sectors here, especially out to the south and the west, so pushing out and down as well. Of course, this is part of a larger envelopment here that will then turn into the envelopment of Pokrovsk, Minograd. We can see both pushes in the north as well. So definitely making ground on these front lines, at least by Syriac maps. And then we'll come down, and I spoke about this area. This is Rozliv. Yesterday I spoke in the tree line down around here. We saw there was targeting of Russian forces in here, showed you the geolocation, and this is being updated just in and around here by then this Syriac map today, although showing less around this curvature of the road than deep state is showing. So I'd go with deep state on this, but showing in this tree line is where we spoke about yesterday, as well the complete occupation of Uspanivkia, which is where that envelopment, the Ilenikia pocket, closed up maybe 2 weeks ago-ish. So let's just move, we're in this sector, let's talk about Kurakhove, and I think this is days away from coming under complete occupation by the Russian forces. So showing that from Kurakhove to the south here, that a lot of this is coming under control. You can see this tree line here. This is said tree line up to the road through here is this one. So right up to where my cursor is at the moment, coming under control also are these major defensive works that have been falling to the Russian forces as well. Again, enveloping this area. As you can see in the north around Stary Turny, which is this red dot where that dam was, this all closing up to Sontanivskia, seen by the red dot in there. So we'll continue moving just a little bit further west, and of course we have Velika Novosilka. We've said is these three roads have been cut off. Other maps are sharing this. This map is showing it is grey zone. I'll show the geolocation of Russian forces in the tree line beyond this road. Suryak is now saying this, Velika Novosilka front, the Russian army cut western supply route to Ukrainian army in Vreminka and Velika Novosilka. This is a big problem because these are going to have to then move across open ground, and the weather is getting poorer and poorer. There's also water crossings in here and bridges going down, but I agree with what AMK mapping said. Don't expect to see Ukraine pull out of here. They're known for pulling out late, as am I anyway, but they're known for pulling out late in other areas and getting encircled. Makarivka is the most common of this. That is what the cancellation of Deep State was over, and some troops getting stuck in those encirclements. So watch that space. That is incredibly important. Now, this is the far northeastern corner, and this area in here, at least by Suryak, there's a lot of development in here. In this Dvorinchna, that it is saying that Russia is right up to this intersection. You can see it sort of cutting around here, that they are occupying a lot of this area. And then we come down into Pishani front. So I'm a little bit up here. So we have, this is the Pishani front. And let's have a look at where then Suryak is saying the Russians are up to. So if you see where this turns back around in this tree line, that basically right across where my cursor is here, that the Russians are moving in that direction down to the south. Supply logistics to the Ukrainians all the way from Lazova to Zarazove is going to be very difficult now that that is cut off and the bridges are down in those sectors. Now, we have some rare footage as well here of an X-101, a Russian cruise missile, striking a power plant in Dnipro. This is something that we don't see that often. You can see then these trace rounds trying to intercept both missiles and drones in the sky, and then we get very clear footage of a strike on the power plant here and a very, very large and hot explosion then taking place in this sector. So again, I believe that Russia is having more success with these missiles from the degraded air defense in Ukraine and increased capacity of these missiles. We've seen the missiles with flares in them. We've seen Russia increase Iskander production. I don't know how much. I think it would be like tenfold. The amount of Iskanders we're seeing being used basically as a disposable bloody weapon at this point. But we've also seen those Iskanders have come under, in a policy shift, under artillery so they can come on target much, much faster. So let's talk about long-range strikes here. Now, Tachiragami Ue, he shared some thoughts about this as well, but he goes back to October 24, and our Frontline Intelligence Insight published an analysis showing that the limited number of remaining ATACMS was unlikely to have a significant impact on the battlefield. While we didn't share the exact numbers publicly, they are now available in the New York Times article. So basically saying agrees with these numbers. They didn't put them out, but these are the numbers. So this is then the New York Times article. Ukraine slows firing of missiles into Russia as Trump prepares to take office. And something that you and I have observed of this war more recently is we have said we have not seen, well, these got signed off and we expect to see a shitload of these being fired. We haven't seen them now for some time. Of these long-range strikes that we're going to be taking down Su-34s and this and that. We haven't seen any of that for now a couple of weeks. The long-range missiles provided by the US and Britain were used to strike inside Russian territory, despite concerns that their use would escalate the conflict. Kyiv's stockpiles are running out. With much fanfare, Ukraine was granted permission to fire Western long-range missiles at Russian military targets more than a month ago. But after initially firing a flurry of them, Ukraine has already slowed their use. And this isn't because Ukraine don't want to fire them. It's because Russia's moved the targets out of range, which we knew had already occurred for a lot of the targets. And not only are stockpiles of these for Ukraine low, stockpiles in the West are low, and the industrial capacity to make more of this, that is still very low too. This is one of the primary concerns I have about if China started a war somewhere tomorrow. How long of high-end AD and medium-range missiles, how many do we actually have? How much has been used up? And I think the attitude towards another war, the stockpiles at the moment, both are the lowest. The appetite for war, I should say, and the stockpiles, they're the lowest I think it will ever be in the West. And if we saw China make a move on Taiwan militarily, which I'm still not convinced we will see, but if we did see that, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw it around now, because people, especially in America, are not going to want to intervene in another conflict, and stockpiles, this is the lowest point they are ever going to be. But the article continues here. Kiev is running out of missiles. It might also be running out of time. President-elect Donald Trump has publicly said publicly that allowing US-made long-range missiles into Russia was a big mistake. So far, the missiles have been effective in limited ways, but they have not changed the war's trajectory. And with what Trump has said here, a lot of this was aimed at, it was made after the Democrats lost the election. So after that had happened, then they signed it off being like, well, you deal with the problem. And I agree. I think these long-range strikes should have been signed off a year ago, and Biden deal with what became of that. But it is cheap, poor leadership to, someone else will deal with it. It is, in my opinion, a prick act. I agree with the use of this. It's in a war, but the way it was done is showing the absolute weakness, the incompetence, the lack of accountability of that the current administration. I forget that he's actually still in power, him and Kamala, who are more interested in my opinion, emotions and idealism rather than reality and how people are seeing it, and the election results, they prove this, in my opinion. The war has also not escalated as some have feared. First case use ever of an IRBM, tech to Iran plus North Korea, potentially China as well. Like I've been saying, it's not escalation in Ukraine. Russia can't do that other than nuclear systems or major losses, maybe Pyrrhic victories, but it can escalate in other sectors, just as the US, Turkey and Ukraine have escalated in Syria. And a lot of that aimed at Iran and Russia in that hybrid somewhat warfare, not hybrid for Turkey at least, and there's been the things going on in Syria now, as we presumed, are absolutely horrible. Let's continue on this though. Although Russia launched a powerful new intermediate-range hypersonic ballistic missile at Ukrainian weapons facilities after the first 2 volleys of Western long-range missiles, it has since responded to them with their usual mix of drones, missiles, and threats. So we've only seen one of those Otoshniks being fired. US officials say they believe Russia was trying to avoid escalating military operations in Ukraine, especially when the election of Mr. Trump, a long-time skeptic of the war, and given Russia's recent battlefield successes, they spoke on the condition of anonymity given the political sensitiveness. And I believe this is why we have not seen another Otoshnik fired or a huge response to the Lieutenant General being killed. If Russia escalate, so will NATO. It's that escalation ladder that gets climbed. I think Russia is going, we're not happy with this, we would like to escalate, but we have to be patient, do what we're doing, and just grind forward slowly, because that grind forward slowly is not then going to have some huge escalation and more systems or troops deployed over. We grind forward slowly, and that is our way to win. That is how I am reading into this, and that is why I have raised concerns about false flag attacks happening, and why the propaganda, what I see around North Koreans, is so pushed by every single level at the moment. If Russia's just grinding forward, we need reasons for more aid to go to Ukraine. It's just war. It's not good or bad. It's just propaganda is a part of war and an incredibly important part of war. Anyway, Rob Bauer, NATO's most senior military officer, said recently the strikes by the long-range ballistic, the ATACMS, had seriously hit a number of weapons factories and ammo depots in Russia. He said that had forced Russia to move many logistics facilities farther back from the front, although the actual frontline effect we've seen of this was limited. We saw big explosions. We've definitely seen things move. We've seen things become more difficult. But as far as a game changer, which people promised, no. They don't like the ATACMS coming in their own country through the air. They don't, because they are effective. And they are effective, but as we know, the longer this goes on, the less effective they will become from jamming and from air defences as well. And we've seen this particularly with the Storm Shadow. That limits their ability to fight effectively at the front, and that's what you want. So it's a strategic system. The question is, then, is it enough to win? In my opinion, no, especially the numbers given. And you need serious long range, not medium range, because all the bombers, all the Su-34s, whatever, are just outside of that in safety. In some ways, what has happened with the ATACMS, pronounced ATACMS, is the story of what happened with the other Western weaponry in the war. Ukraine pressed for months and even years to get Western weapons, HIMARS, Abrams, F-16s. And in my opinion, while ignoring the unsexy items that don't look good in photographs or in then areas of government, by ignoring that and ignoring things like trenches, night vision, radio, and men at the front line, that has done this because it looks good and look at this capability rather than what is actually being asked for. And the guys I speak to, and I've shared this multiple times, have said we need a night vision on every corner of the trench. We need more guys, we need better radios, and we need better fortifications. And they're like, the F-16s are doing nothing for us, but we're getting overrun because we don't have that equipment. And the equipment there, the cost of that, for the price of one of these systems, can basically put a night vision at cost price through hundreds of kilometres of the front line. But by the time the West granted access to these weapons, Ukraine had lost even more ground. No weapon has been a silver bullet, although it's been promised to be. Western officials say that Ukraine has relied too much on help from the West and hasn't done enough to bolster its own war effort, especially in mobilising enough troops or fortifications or command or corruption. What has a huge effect on all of this, it is not mutually exclusive. The corruption, the command issues, that can prevent people then volunteering to fight and people hiding from mobilisation. So not enough has been done there. But again, in that propaganda of what I shared in the beginning of this video, that propaganda and the shift of blame, that is what I predict we will see a shitload in the coming weeks or months. We've already seen a lot. In the spring, President Biden relented. The administration shipped Ukraine as many as 500 missiles from Pentagon stockpiles. The US official said while Ukraine couldn't use them in Russia, they fired them at targets in eastern Ukrainian territories controlled by Russia and in Crimea, aimed at hardened command and control posts, weapon storage areas, and some other bunkers, with limited success on these, of course. US and NATO officials said those strikes have been effective, but also said they felt Ukraine could have been more judicious with the number of missiles used and more selective with targeting. And this is something you and I have brought up, is some of the things hit was a bit like, was that worth it with this? But at the same time, I think it's a bit rich of the US or UK or French officials to do this, because we know for a fact from the German leaked phone calls and also how these weapon systems operate that US and NATO have a lot to do with the targeting, corrections, and aiming of these systems. So you can't blame just Ukraine with all of this. You guys are absolutely on the back end, and we know this. Ukraine doesn't have satellites in the air, so there's some blame there. But in my opinion with this is more selective targeting. There may not have been any other targets because a lot of those have just been moved outside of that range. US officials said Mr. Biden had justified granting permission on November 17th to use the missiles on Russia because Moscow brought North Korean soldiers into the war. Again, link that back to the beginning. See what I mean? I think if this war ends and we have never seen what I'd consider concrete evidence of North Korean POWs, I honestly would not be surprised. I think they're there, but when you line up the incentive for it, questions get raised, at least in my head. At that point, Ukraine only had tens of missiles left, maybe about 50. The US official said it had no likelihood of getting more. The limited American supplies had already been assigned for deployment in the Middle East and Asia. Officials in Britain, which allowed Ukraine to use long-range Storm Shadow missiles inside Russia after Mr. Biden's decision, said recently they didn't have many more to provide, and the industrial capacity is limited on making more of these. It's unlikely Trump will step in and fill the gap. He recently told Time magazine he disagreed very vehemently with Ukraine's use of ATACMS in Russian territory and Mr. Biden's decision to provide them foolish. And of course, this was after the loss of the election, but definitely limited missiles. Since the US and Britain granted permission, Ukraine has launched at least half a dozen missile strikes using at least 31 ATACMS and 14 Storm Shadows. So again, not that many. What have we said? You need massive attacks. It has to be simultaneous and successive. Otherwise, things can just move and tactics can change to fit around that. The most damaging attack from the Storm Shadows was on November 20th at what was said to be a Russian command bunker near Medino in Kursk. On November 21, Russia launched a new hypersonic missile, the Otoshnik. So a day after this, the hazelnut tree is what it stands for. This was seen as a warning that Russia could hit any part of Europe with the new missile. 6 days later, the Russian general, who was the architect of Ukraine's invasion, called Mr. Biden's top military advisor to discuss concerns about escalation, insisting that its missile test had been long planned. And we know there was notice given of a ballistic test as well. after the November 27th call, Ukraine didn't fire ATACMS or STEM shadows for 2 weeks. Despite his public threats, Mr. Putin is trying to react carefully to Ukrainian operations. They believe Moscow will likely not respond to ATACMS strikes in a way that could risk drawing Washington deeper into the fight and put the new administration in an awkward position as it comes in. Putin wants to keep Trump sort of on his side and also doesn't want further escalation here, that grind forward, because I think they go, well, the way it's going at the moment, yes, if there's strikes against military command and this and that, but the way things are going in the front line, continue this, then we'll have more success, or we will be in a significant position of power for negotiations. Moscow could step up cyber or sabotage attacks in Europe, which we have seen carried out allegedly by the FSB. But it is unlikely to directly target US interest. Some analysts said Ukraine had slowed its missile use because it had initially targeted Russian facilities it had long wanted to hit. And now, with few missiles remaining, Ukraine is being more deliberate. We decided to wait and find high-value capability, and that's natural. Because we need to preserve this capability and spend it judiciously and very wisely. So we really haven't seen these create, in the beginning, a bit of an effect. But what then flow and do we see on the front line? Just because something is smoking and this and that is tactical success. But strategic success is, well, how is that then affecting the troops in X spot? And what we have seen is then from Kursk, these strikes, it has not managed to slow the Russian advancement in other areas. What is slowing the Russian advancement at the moment, in my opinion, is weather and exhaustion from these soldiers now fighting, being on offensive for now basically a whole year. That is slowing it. I don't believe it's the resistance and the long-range strikes. That is an element, I believe maybe 10 or 15%, but I believe the other 85% of why we're seeing the kilometre squares through December be less than November and October is what we predicted months ago, even when Russia was moving faster as the weather comes in. So people are saying that we could be 20-something days away from the end of the war if Trump is correct in saying that he can end the war in a day. Now, I don't believe this because I don't see at this point why Putin would end the war given the situation that it's looking like across the border in Ukraine. It's the successes that his military is having after that initial large defeats that were occurring. This from the Washington Post. As Ukraine marks Christmas, exhausted soldiers wonder if Trump can end the war. Asked their thoughts about potential ceasefire on 25, Ukrainian soldiers said they'd welcome a reprieve, but were skeptical, one was coming soon. And what you'll see in this is not what the propagandists say who aren't on the front line and aren't prepared to go on the front line on Twitter or Telegram or TikTok or whatever. These guys in the front who are exhausted, who have been fighting, and they see what is actually happening. Bagarov spent the rest of the day dressed in a colourful jacket and carrying painted spinning star while merrily singing traditional Ukrainian carols and banging a tambourine against his thigh. And what I will say is gentlemen like this in areas of the front line are an absolute blessing to bring some happiness and some morale to other soldiers. His audience, though thankful for the attempt at a holiday cheer, was noticeably less enthused. Kirillo said there is no good mood. He's a deputy battalion commander, saying no one feels like the end is near. The morale keeps sinking lower and lower, getting worse and worse. Morale is a huge problem. Desertion, we know in the tens of thousands, is a huge problem. And then mobilisation, of course, this is all interlinked, becoming massive frontline issues. I'm waiting for when NATO and the tens of thousands sitting there go and fix this, because they could. But at the end of the day, what's going to break first, the Russian economy or the Ukrainian lines? In my opinion, the Ukrainian lines, and that's why Putin may not stop. He may keep going. What happens? What happens if the Ukrainian front line fully collapses? That was my question to you. I was thinking about this in bed last night. If the Ukrainian line just fully collapses, like completely, and Russia's making 15 Ks a day, 50 Ks a day, what does NATO do at that point if Russia looks like they'll move to the border? Now, I don't know if that will happen. Well, at some point in a protracted attritional war, that does happen because there's no energy or weapons or anything left to fight, or people. But then what occurs? Would Russia just take what they want, or would they continue to the border of NATO? And some would say they'll cross into NATO. That's ridiculous. The Kremlin know they don't have the power for that, and the Kremlin have never said they want that, even in their most radical propaganda, officially. But what happens at that point? What does NATO do? What does NATO do if Putin just says, no, it's continuing? Because long-range strikes, this and that, takes a long time. It's very expensive. There's not that much. And mobilised manpower is the primary issue. Anyway, we'll continue. This holiday season marks Ukraine's third straight since Russia's invasion. The President-elect Donald Trump's promise of negotiations to end the war has many questioning if there will be a fourth. Trump is already pressuring European nations to increase aid to Ukraine while signalling that security assistance from the US, Ukraine's biggest backer, will decline. And if the US pull out, it's over. But he has not disclosed details of how he plans to force Russian President Vladimir Putin to the negotiating table. And Ukrainian and Russian delegates have not met since the first months of the war in 2022. You also need to bring Zelensky to the table as well. In past years, officials in Kyiv and soldiers on the battlefield expressed commitment to fighting until the occupying Russian forces were defeated and pushed off Ukrainian land. Again, that propaganda I shared in the beginning, or the elements of propaganda going from a fight of victory to a fight of survival, that is the narrative shift that we have seen very recently also. Now, nothing left on that slide. No, went through it. Sometimes I miss the very bottoms of these. Asked for their thoughts about a potential ceasefire on 25, soldiers in Ukraine's 33rd Brigade said they'd welcome a reprieve, but was skeptical one was coming. Many expressed doubt that Putin would settle for peace while Russian forces have continued to make gains and maintain the offensive initiative. And I agree vehemently, or as Trump would say, very vehemently, with that. If Russia is continually making gains, maintaining offensive initiative, they have the upper hand in the important things as manpower, munitions, tanks, shells, long-range strikes, why then would they stop? And if they do stop, what is going to be bloody asked for? It's going to be, in my opinion here, the peace deal would probably see Moscow keep territory it has captured, more than 20% of Ukraine. Given the acute manpower and missile shortages in Ukraine, why would Putin settle for just the 20%? Why wouldn't he say, well, I want all of the 4 oblasts and Crimea, or potentially even more if it's crossed into Sumy, or I will continue? Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky has said recently active hostilities could end next year and Kyiv would work to diplomatically return its occupied lands at a later date. In my opinion, if the war settles, however this is agreed to, if Putin agrees to this, Zelensky agrees to this, if there's an end to this, there's not going to be, that is, they want the end there so it doesn't start again either way. That Ukraine don't try and take that back or Russia try and expand it, it's going to stop dead there. And in my opinion, if the guns stop, that land is gone. That's the way I see this diplomatically, that no one wants it to be still up in the air. They want a physical, proper end. Some soldiers on Wednesday said they fear the US would discontinue its critical weapons support if Kyiv didn't agree to territorial concessions in the interim. Others acknowledged that they're ceding land now, even as they continue to fight. So we have the US support, we are fighting, and we still are losing more and more land. We used to talk about victory before. Now it's unclear. At this point in time, this is what I spoke about before. There was talk of victory. Now there's talk of survival. And can there be a survival here? And this is what I call the manpower paradox. If you watch me, you know what I'm on about, where I say Ukraine's in an existential fight of its survival. And I agree with this. But it is not mobilising men to survive and saying that we can't mobilise those because if we do mobilise those, therefore we won't have a future generation to survive. And that's what I say is the paradox, is, well, you need to do one or the other. This sitting in limbo without rotational mobilisation laws, they're just not going to have men. Alexander, 26, says, I'm worried we will just be abandoned. Those are the thoughts that creep in. That the support and deliveries from our allies, the ammunition, will just stop. If we don't have that, we won't have anything to shoot with. And even with it at the moment, it is moving routes. And this is probably my biggest concern for this war is that if the US stops support and Zelensky doesn't stop the war, it turns a difficult situation into an impossible situation, and what will be absolutely horrible. If the US stops support, Zelensky needs to stop the war, or else it is going to be horrible, and history will look back unkindly on Putin, but also very unkindly on Zelensky continuing an impossible operation at that point in time if the US pulls out. You may not like it, but in my opinion, that is true. We have heard that opinion is built off what Zelensky himself has said, that if the US pull out, we cannot continue. But if US pull out, Zelensky doesn't continue and this goes there, I don't know what Zelensky's future holds for himself, or the government, or Ukraine. But most Ukrainian military personnel acknowledge that soldier shortages are now just as critical as the weapons deficits. Some specialised jobs in the 33rd, such as a driver for APCs, were down to just one person in a battalion. A battalion, at least from where I was serving, is just over 600 people. You're down to one driver for logistics, transport troops safely back and forth to trench positions, that is unbelievable. 37-year-old Dennis, not the Dennis, a Dennis who goes to the front line to supply, to serve his country and not become a multi-millionaire, a drone operator here. He says, do we even have infantry? It's down to a couple of guys and they're over 50 years old. What are they going to do? And infantry, the demand physical on that, I'm sorry, but your best troops sit young, 18 to 25. That's where your best troops are. Not your best NCOs, not your best commanders, not your best special forces, but your best regular infantry are there. I served in the infantry for many, many years. Felix, 39, who was responsible for providing logistical and morale support for his unit, said fighters are simply exhausted. He hoped Trump's January inauguration would mark a turning point in the war towards negotiations because it could provide soldiers with a much-needed break. It can't go on like this. We're withdrawing and they're pushing further and further. What kind of victory will happen? If our officials can't put an end to it, maybe Trump can. And look, what I'm getting out of this is a lot of guys are saying, fuck, we can't win this. We need to take what we can now. Because I agree with what Professor Mearsheimer said, and I've said this for a couple of years now. He said the end of 22, that was the high water line for Ukraine after the successful Kherson-Kharkiv offensive and withdrawal and the, not defeat, but the position that the Russian forces in at a long time. That was the chance. That was the chance to either deploy NATO in and push the Russians out when you had them in the back foot, or the chance to go, right, this is the negotiation here, not to let, and he was saying this at the time, not to let the Russians go back, recuperate, and the position that we are seeing now, fighting better with higher industrial capacity than we have seen. As Lavrov said, and as many Russian authors and people that study Russian culture have said, it takes Russians a long time to stand up. And I believe this is exactly what we're seeing in attritional protracted war such as this. Ukraine's 33rd Brigade was initially created out of optimism to take back territory ahead of the highly anticipated counteroffensives on the southern Zaporizhia region last year. Of course, that now infamous 2023 counteroffensive. The brigade was one of several new units formed. Its members were trained by allies abroad to operate donated Western equipment, such as the German Leopard tanks. But after the counteroffensive stalled due to a stout Russian defence, the brigade shifted to defensive duties. And this is the problem. That 23 offensive, that was with the best weapons, the highest morale, and the best training that will ever become in this war. Because Ukraine has manpower shortages at the front line, recruitment shortages, the amount of people it can actually send externally to go and get training is very limited. So Russia's just sort of keeping that redlining. That's how the Brusilov offensive operations occur. That's how protracted attritional warfare occurs that stemmed out of him in the First World War. You just push on so many sectors at once that you can never get all your forces to one area to repel something, but at the same time, never supply enough to any other sector or back for training and rotation. And that is exactly what I believe the Russian forces are doing. It's now one of the units holding the hottest part of the front line around Kurakhove in Ukraine's eastern Donetsk region. And why I say that is, will Ukraine ever be able to actually have the troops off the front to train, equip, rest, to then go on offensive actions? Russian forces have made rapid gains here, intensifying their attacks in what analysts and Western officials have said is probably a bid to occupy as much land as they can before Trump's inauguration and the possible start of ceasefire negotiations. The more Russia can get, the better position they'll be. And this is exactly what Ukraine tried to do in Kursk. I don't get it, but it is what Ukraine tried to do in Kursk. And this is why I believe Russia want to get a foothold in the right bank of Dnipro in Kherson. If they can get area in the right bank of the right bank of Dnipro in Kherson, and can push Ukraine out of Kursk by the time Trump is in, they will be in an even stronger position of power at the negotiating table. And it's going to be hard to say at that point, well, let's just draw it here, because the last thing Ukraine want, the border drawn here is terrible for Ukraine. But at the border, if Russia have troops across here, even a tiny bit, really bad. Same as if then the negotiation was Ukraine keep this part of land up in here. Russia just wouldn't stop at that point. It's people presume that it is just a given that Putin will come to the negotiating table. It's just seen as a given that. Don't take that as a given. The carrot and the stick is going to be how the negotiation is when one party is entering with significantly more power. That's the problem. The stick is currently failing because of manpower, munitions, command corruption, that propaganda's feeding all of that, back to what I said at the beginning about I believe some people have blood on their hands, the stick is failing there. So what you're left with is the carrot. And no one wants to negotiate with Putin or Lavrov. No one's will. So that's why it just may continue, is people say none of this. But I believe Trump sees too, from my limited watching and listening to Trump, is he does see that having a relationship with Russia, Putin, Kremlin in the future, whatever you want to say, is important too. And I believe this because of the rise of the dominance of China. The last thing we want is China really just Russia in the absolute bubble of influence of China, which it sort of already is, because their market has had to move into Asia and China. It's moved there and it's not going to come back. That is a massive problem, because China is the main competitor to the US. In some areas is in front, some areas is behind, but over time it is exponentially increasing and will overtake at some point. Russia can fix a lot of problems for China around ports, grain, lots of other things too, that there needs to be a relationship there to stop it going more of a relationship with China. Now, I believe it's too late for that. I believe the time for that was 30 years ago, or maybe 2004, but that's not good for the future of what they see as a multipolar world. And I agree that this century is going to be the rise of a power to really challenge the US economically, militarily, whatever, and we're probably a lot closer to it than many would see. As Chaplain Bagarov visited one group of soldiers after another, lifting his robe and his boots sank into the heavy mud, he acknowledged the troops' mood was grim. What mood? He joked. His prediction for the next year was a ceasefire by Easter, followed by Christmas caroling with families away from the front line, saying, "We cannot live without hope." Inside one of the brigade's medical stations for soldiers with minor injuries, a 48-year-old Ole was spending Christmas recovering from shrapnel wounds to his spine, saying this won't end soon. The Russians won't stop this. They don't want to live peacefully. And I think the Russians, at least from the page I'm seeing, they are literally sniffing a victory here at the moment, that they believe they're that close to it. And what we see, and I speak about this in the more layman's terms, I call it the bankruptcy of warfare. And attritional war is bankruptcy. It's little by little and then all at once. And what did we see in the end of 22? We saw throughout 22, little by little, positional fighting, and then all at once, Kharkiv, Kherson, way back until lines fell a long, long way. And if we come onto the map, in some areas was as far as, say, 85 kilometres until the Russians hit that hard stopper. Now, this is what I'm saying about this bankruptcy, is at some point, if the war continues, if the war does not settle on negotiations in under a month's time, when President Trump then comes into the administration, if it doesn't settle then there is a victory and a loser in the war. And some will say the Russian economy will collapse before the Ukrainian front lines. And in my opinion, trying to look at this as unbiased as possible and talking to soldiers and speaking to economics experts, the front line is much closer to a complete collapse than the economy. My question then becomes, what happens if the front line completely collapses, and instead of looking like this, it looks something like this, or it looks like down the Dnieper? And I don't want to misquote him here, but I believe Alex from History Legends, correct me if I'm wrong, he said in our interview together, he said he doesn't think it'll stop until the physical border of the Dnieper River. And this is what's such a problem, if Russia can actually gain a foothold on the other side of the Dnieper, on the right bank down in Kherson. Then I want to know from you guys, what happens if Russia doesn't stop? What happens if the front line has a complete collapse? Do NATO step in and fight Russia? I don't think they're prepared to do this. And I also think Russia doesn't want to fight NATO, but also believe NATO and their stockpiles isn't ready for a large war somewhere else. And this is why I've said, I believe if China wanted to step in somewhere now militarily, maybe not economically for them, maybe not for their military, but at least when we are weaker from the use of shells, economics, whatever, that are struggling, and a large majority of people in the US and in Europe and in Australia don't have the appetite for another bloody war, maybe it's their time to make more bold moves, just like the cables that connect Estonia and Finland, other bits and pieces like this. don't underestimate China's capacity. People have this idea of China's stuck in the 90s. Don't think like that at all. Like I've said, the reason Russia is having success is not technical overmatch. It's not soldier skill overmatch. It is quality through quantity, and just the quantity of shit. Russia's still launching armoured assaults into areas 1,039 days, more than that, sorry, that's a couple of days old, 1,040 something days into this bloody war. Still armoured assaults. The amount of equipment is astronomical. And I do fear that once that equipment ends, if the tanks end, the tactic is just going to shift, and it's going to just be in this constant state of flux that we have seen. I don't know. I think at this point in time, Ukraine they needed to do 12 months ago mass mobilisation of men to push this back, or try and stabilise it, or seek the best possible deal in negotiations. But this limbo period, I think, is doing nothing but extending the suffering of guys. Now, Legends, I waffled for a minute because I wanted to break the 1 hour mark. We have popped our cherry here. Legends, you look after yourself. You have a fantastic weekend, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.